Hello. Very nice to see you. It's the first time that I'm going to speak this early in the morning. So I hope my words will make sense. They already do a little bit, so I think I'm okay. Yeah, it's really nice to be here, and it's kind of interesting to speak to a crowd of people where I guess I don't know where you're from, and I don't know what your interests are. I guess that we're all here because we have some sort of interest in listening to a bit about performance. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And yes, as Sandra said, my name is Sophie Grodin, as it says there. I grew up here in Copenhagen, and when I was about 19, 20 years old, I realized that I wanted to work in the world of theater and performance, but I didn't know exactly in what way. And I couldn't see myself fitting into any of the sort of pre-made boxes that were sort of available to me here. I had to choose whether I wanted to be an actor or a director or a scenographer, or I had to be very specific, and I didn't know how to, I didn't want to. I wanted to experiment, and I wanted to be able to be in a situation where I could figure that out as I went along. So I looked to London, and I saw it, and I found a school called Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. And in this school, they had maybe 6 years before, they'd opened this course called Performance Arts. And in this course, the point was to experiment. It was very interdisciplinary, which means that they would mix together information and teaching from lots of different disciplines in order to teach performance. And that sounded very good to me. And I thought, I'll try it to see. If I don't like it, I can always come back. The same course had undergone many different name changes. So I think before I started, maybe the year before, it had changed from contemporary theater to performance arts. And this idea of this way of working, not having a specific name or finding it hard to pin down exactly what genre it belongs to, is something I want to get more into later, because that's kind of one of the big, not problems, I don't want to call it a problem, but it can be difficult sometimes to exactly know if we're talking about the same thing. So in this school, the teachers were from all sorts of different disciplines, as I said. So we had writers and dancers and theater makers and puppeteers and theater producers and architects. They all came and taught us. And the first thing they wanted to do was to completely shatter the way that we thought about theater. So if you thought you knew what a piece of theater was, they were like, no, you don't. There is a lot of different ways to do this. And they also wanted us to completely rearrange the way we thought about process. So how do you start making a piece of work? And they completely did. And I think my mind was pretty blown in the first year. So we were going to be developed as practitioners and as artists, but we also had to learn how to produce our own work, because one thing is to make a piece of work, another thing is how do you get it into the world, and how do you get it seen, and how do you get money for that, and how do you sort of produce yourself? And that was something that they also taught us, and which was quite helpful. So that's where I started. So I stayed in London for 6 years, and I only returned to Copenhagen a year and a half ago. And it was in London that I developed my understanding of what art was, what theater was. It was where I even started making work, and it was where I became an adult, if you could say that I'm an adult, almost. And that's where I created a big network of collaborators and contacts and a network. And yes, so that's why it can be very hard to come back. And so what I want to talk about today is the work that I do, which is mainly collaborative work. It's built on devising and very careful composition. I want to talk about how to include the audience and overcoming the fear of not being understood as a theater maker or performance maker. And I want to go into more depth about collaboration and how that's an essential part of the work that I do. And then finally, I want to talk about the anxiety that comes with being without my long-term collaborators and having to start a new place with new people. So first of all, I want to talk about a little bit what is this performance, because I think a lot of different people have different ideas about what it is. Probably in this room we will all have a different idea. So actually I want to ask you guys, when I say the word performance, what is the first thing that comes to your mind, if anything? Maybe nothing, but have a moment to think. Stage. Mm-hmm. Live. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are there any specific artists that come to your mind when you think about the word performance art? Hmm? No, it's cool. I just wanted to hear exactly like what came into your mind the first time. You said dance. Yeah. So as you can hear, there's lots of different ways, and I think that's quite the point of performance. Talk about performance is that it sort of defies one genre. It can hold all of them, and yet it is none of those things. And for me, if I should give you some sort of pointing towards something that I'm more like, it is a kind of performance theater. Maybe you've heard about Pina Bausch, which is both dance, but it's also theater, and there is no one story that runs through it, but it can be lots of different moments, and you read it in the way that you read it. So pieces that, so the pieces I make, they often happen in a theater space, but yet they are not theater. So in the work I do, uses bodies in time and space, and the audience is presented with a sequence of actions to follow in order to follow a train of thought or a succession of ideas. So it's different from the more traditional theater forms, which is often writer-led, as this kind of performance combines flexible forms of narrative with alternate forms of expression through movement, sound, installation, materials, and props. And the way I often describe what I do is like a live collage. So it's a connection of different textures and different moments and different textures, sounds, and moments. And the way you look at it and the way you read it will be very different to the person next to you. Just to come with a tiny quote that I found in a book I really like called Performative Realism. Rune Gade and Anne Jerslev writes about performance that it questions the conventional divisions between binary oppositions as reality and fiction, representation and presentation, life and art, true and false, private and public. And then there is another quote from a woman called Sophie Grodin in the same anthology, and she says, rather than illusion, psychological realism, and a plot with a beginning, middle, and end, the chief point of performance is the processual aspect and the meaning-generating interaction between performers and the audience. It presents a number of scenic actions in relation to which it is up to individual spectator to ascribe meaning. Performance explores the underside of theatre, gives the audience a glimpse of its inside, its reverse side, its hidden face. So for me, it's liberating to work in this intersection. But working in between the more established art forms such as dance and theatre, it can create a kind of confusion because people are like, what is it that you do? And the only way they can see that is to actually experience a piece. It creates a difficulty because there is a lack of a shared vocabulary sometimes. And in the beginning, or for a long time, I've taken that as a big challenge. And along the way, I learned that maybe misunderstandings could be good. Maybe it's okay that people don't know what I mean. Maybe not understanding leads to a different kind of way of talking together that actually leads to something that you wouldn't have been able to come up with yourself. So, let's jump. I could have done that 2 minutes ago. So, in 2012, I began 2 long-term collaborations, and I'm still working with them all today. And one was with a woman called Karen Christopher, and she was part of an American performance group called Goat Island for 30 years almost. It was a group that I was very inspired by when I was studying, and I was very lucky to meet her, and we started working together. And the other collaborators I will come back to later, so I'll start with Karen. So Karen is twice my age. She's performed and taught for many, many years. And when we start to collaborate, I constantly ask myself, why does this woman want to work with me? I'm just a 22-year-old person who's never done any real things. And, and I constantly ask myself this. And at some point, I had to just stop and say, okay, we are each bringing something different to this process. The fact that we are different ages, the fact that I know nothing brings something new to the work that she does. The questions that I ask might bring something new to the work. So I had to just focus on what was in front of us, and that was making a piece. Here you see us making a piece. Working on our first piece, Control Signal. So we made 2 shows, and in both cases we research and we write and we direct and we perform, both of us. We do everything, just the 2 of us. So we devise the work, which means that it's made from scratch every time. I know that many different people would probably also use the word devise in different ways, but the way that I use it is that we start from nothing and then we make everything up in the studio together. So we don't start from a pre-written text. And in the devising process, we have to be clear about heading somewhere without really knowing where we're going, and without really narrowing down where that is until the work shows us. The work is a kind of living organism. We have to be in the space, and we have to move in order to find something. We also have to resist clinging on to preconceived notions. And when the end of the work comes, we have to find a way of loving it, even if it wasn't what we hoped it would be. So in our first piece, Control Signal, which we are stumbling around in the space, doing we're doing a dance routine here. We asked a question to start with. We asked, what never stops? That was our starting point. And then we start researching and digging for different answers to this. And it led us to look at electricity. Electricity as a thing that constantly is in the air between us. We looked at electricity throughout history, and it led us to look at what you can't actually see. We were drawn by the ideas of invisible connections between bodies and a specific place. We investigated the body as a conduit for the passage of electricity. And we researched our need to control our immediate surroundings and each other and nature. In the process, we wrote each other prompts or questions that we would then try to answer. This is a example of that. And so the way we do it is we write a statement or a prompt, and then the other person is trying to respond to that with a performative fragment. So they have to respond to it by making a mini performance. And in that way, we start to generate more and more sort of bits of material that we can then start to piece together if we choose to keep it. So in the collaborative process, we are listening for a lot of answers to the questions we pose. We're not just looking to find one answer that fits all circumstances. Part of collaborating for us is allowing influences at play in the world around us to affect the direction we work. We amble around for a while, trying and testing where we are in relation to each other, our surroundings and our current interest, as well as the material that we bring to the moment. We search for a context in which an idea can be heard. And the moment that we can make an idea heard for each other, then we can start figuring out when the audience, how we can portray that audience with that same idea. And when we have all our bits and material, that takes a long time to make. And some of it we might never use. We can start putting it together in a structure. Like a collage, we start piecing it together one bit after another. And then suddenly we start to see a pattern take shape. And again, sometimes we don't even know exactly what that pattern means yet. We have to allow to keep the things that we like for a moment and see how they look next to each other. So it's one action after another. And we want to create a situation where we allow for the audience to be part of the meaning making. So when we make our structure, when we put things together, we are trying to put gaps into this structure for the audience to fill out. For example, when moving from one scene to another, or, well, how do I explain this? It's in a way that the way the elements come after another might not make an immediate sense, but later on, the audience will be able to fill in the gaps with the information they get along the way. So the way they understand the work when they see it will change over the course of the show. In this way, the audience imagination becomes as big a part of the content as what we're doing on stage. We want them to be part of it. Not having all the gaps filled can also feel uncomfortable or boring to an audience sometimes. Sometimes they will go away in their mind while watching it. Sometimes they will feel, I don't get this. This is not for me. This kind of art is not for me. But I think that the more time you spend with any type of work, the more you find your own way of being with it. When leaving the experience as an audience member, you have to then continue to work on it yourself in your own head. The memory of the artwork starts to merge with the everyday life. I'm just going to go in here. This is control signal. And whilst doing everyday actions such as washing the dishes or cycling to work, the memory pieces from the performance comes back to you. And a simple movement that in the moment of experience it seemed abstract comes back as an association. In control signal, there's this bit where we are waving our hands through the air, like you were seeing on the last images. And we have this dance, of this movement section, where we are standing next to each other and we are pushing the air like this. And then there's a moment when we do this. And then we continue some movements 3 times in different heights. So we end up on the floor like this. And people would come to us afterwards and say all their different associations to that moment. And some people saw it as a sort of waving goodbye, and some other people saw it as getting rid of something. And then there was a writer that wrote a response to this moment. And I just want to read that response to you. So she writes, "Not long ago, you saw 2 hands waving, 2 palms carving through the air, as if the air was heavy as smoke and dark as matter, as if the movement of the hands could whip the air into a kind of thickness. And at that time, you thought about the shapes of the heads in front of you and the bodies you have left in the foyer, and the person sitting behind you who is wearing a coat that crackles when she turns. And at that time, you admired the smooth uniformity of the movement across 2 hands that belonged to 2 women born half a generation apart, smooth and sure like a slow and accomplished dance. And you could see from the concentration on the faces of the women whose hands were moving that the carving of their palms through the air clasped something grave and important to itself. But it is only now, a period of time later, that you would measure in minutes if you were counting, which you are not, even quietly to yourself in that muted part of your brain that searches for order in things, like a body searching for another body in a busy street. It is only now that you have seen other things appear on this stage that you realize this smooth and sure movement that whips the air into thickness is also a spell that summons the traces of a plume of smoke that has risen from the head of a woman who was strapped to a chair in a room which may or may not have been dark, while a current was administered by hands and bodies that were not her own and passed through her skin, forced through her nerves, pushed through her synapses until her limbs convulsed and her fingers slammed loudly into one another and something left, a plume of smoke." And then she goes on to talk about it a little bit. And basically this movement that we did gave her time to reflect on all the other moments that she had seen along the piece. It gave her time to put all the pieces of puzzle together. And for us, it sort of showed the way that giving time and repeating things allows the audience time to fill in the gaps by themselves and to create a rich idea of what they're seeing. And that might be different to what other people are seeing. In that way, the experience becomes part of the spectator because of the participation of their own imagination. In this way, I see performance as the audience and the performer developing a language together, or sharing a language together during the course of a quite short time. So whilst working on control signal, we realized that the relationship that we were developing became one of the most important parts of the show. The first time we showed the piece as a work in progress, we couldn't quite remember everything we had to do. So we had to look at each other quite a lot and be like, And we had to all the time do these small check-ins. So when the audience looked at us, they thought that was part of the show. And then they started to read the whole thing through those tiny, small, like sort of glitches in the performance. It wasn't on purpose, it was actual confusion. And afterwards, when we got the feedback, we realized that actually that was one of the things that the audience had liked the best. It wasn't like completely like, well, there was also very choreographed moments that I'm sure created like a sort of a balance between those two things. But we said, okay, let's keep that. Let's try and see if we can keep those small glitches. But how do you keep glitches and how do you keep mistakes when you really start to learn your material? Then you sort of have to start unlearning it a little bit or inserting the moments when small mistakes can happen. And that was a challenge in itself. Let's see how long I've been talking. Wow, okay. Okay, I'm going to go to the next. So we said, okay, let's take this idea of mistakes and glitches and put that into the next show, which was called Miles and Miles. And we wanted to start with this idea of falling in and out of a performance. So you have a structure that you know, and then it's as if the performance falls out of it. I want to see if I can have time to talk about this.
No stress.
No stress. Okay.
Oh, no.
God no. So, so we wanted to alternate between these two moments of being in the moment and falling out of the moment. We wanted to create moments of improvisation so that we could keep surprising each other. We thought about the fragility of the performance moment, of two people finding out as they go along. I asked, how do two performers keep surprising each other, hold the line taut, and then accept the holes in the line? At this point in the beginning, these descriptions were conceptual thoughts. They described the sensation of the performance and of the piece. But now we had to make the piece. And so for a long time we were really frustrated because we didn't find anything. We only knew that we wanted to fall out of the performance, but what did we fall out of if we didn't have the performance? So we made these performance directives, these small questions to each other. And they were both specific or open-ended. And one of the directives was, what is the relationship between inner and outer landscapes? Make a restriction for yourself by creating an edge. For a long time, we thought we would never ever find a solution to this. We actually thought we would not be able to make the show. And we were quite scared because we had a performance date. We knew we had to perform it. But we kept going. And in one of her responses, Karen spoke of an element from the Alfred Hitchcock film Spellbound, a film in which a man is suffering from amnesia and he falls into a fugue state, triggered by these lines on the surface. And she suggested that we watch it. And afterwards, we started to think about loops and amnesia, vertigo, cliffs, fragility, future, past, Ingrid Bergman and Alfred Hitchcock, being stuck, competition, climbing, being saved and wanting to save. The movie had become a springboard, something that other things could leap from. But in this instance, the film was central to our material, but we could have just as well started somewhere else. The important thing was that we had remained open and attentive to our environment. It was not always the intentionally sought after material that ended up in the piece, because sometimes something appears out of the blue, and that is what ends up being used. So once we had the skeleton of the piece, we had to figure out when and how we were to fall out. And we had to create this fine line of playing with the audience's sensation of what was rehearsed and what was happening in the moment. We decided that everything would be allowed in the performance. So if Karen wanted to suddenly sit down on the floor and do nothing, I'd have to just find out how to deal with that. Would I respond to it? Would I keep going? Would I sit down as well? And it was super scary because you never knew exactly what would be happening. So for a long time, we were in this constant state of a kind of anxiety of how will this performance turn out and how will we know that we can get through it? And again, after a while, we got to a point of knowing the material so well and knowing each other so well that anything could happen and we would be okay with it. Sometimes the most magical moments was when a bird was singing outside of the performance space and all the audience were thinking that it was arranged. So it was like, yeah, we did that. Okay. So, gonna jump on to, not so good at using this. Moving on to Room. Room is another collaboration with Alan Fielden, Jemima Young, and myself. And it's a performance for one person at a time. And the audience member is blindfolded, and they come into a space where there are 3 narrators. And they are starting the situation with a scenario. And then we ask the person with the blindfold, what would you like to do now? What do you see? And from that point on, everything is improvised. And the 3 narrators and the person are telling a story together, but they don't know where it will go. And all they have to do actually is read each other's body language and read the story in order for it to go on a journey and come back again after half an hour. And this is inspired by text-based computer games and being told stories with our eyes closed. And this collaboration had been going for like 5 years, and we've performed it over 800 times. And we are now working on a show for the first time where we are all on stage, and it's going to be a work that will be shown in September in London, the Barbican. And I actually think that I'm going to now jump, even though it's going to create a big gap in this, I'm going to jump to where I am now, because otherwise I don't think we will get through the whole thing. So now, having gone quickly through these collaborations, it's a way that I think collaborations. I've found that I can't actually work without people, and I knew that moving to Denmark would be hard, but I don't think I was aware of this I don't think I was as aware of this as the moment when I was quite on my own. I also knew that not only was I leaving my immediate collaborators, I was also leaving a bigger community of people and places I was part of. I knew the performance scene in Denmark is a lot smaller than the one I come from in the UK. And I thought, okay, it's a smaller country. But what I realized when coming here is that the roots of performance and performance studies goes back 20 years or more in the UK. Most bigger universities have performance studies, and papers are written and symposiums held, and hundreds of festivals happen every year. But that was a challenge I was willing to take to come here. So returning to Denmark, I did not really have any other starting point than to do a kind of detective work online, and via people I knew who did work similar to me, and who could I speak to who could share my language. And the first year was really tough, because every time I had an idea, I was used to sharing it with someone who could sort of continue the idea with me. And they could continue it enough to continue my train of thought. And I realized I had gotten so used to thinking with other people, like my brain was more productive in the presence of my collaborators and friends. And suddenly I felt this panic of not being able to finish my thoughts and ideas. And that felt really scary, like I suddenly couldn't do anything by myself, and that my own brain wasn't enough. I went into a kind of lock, an anxiety that this perhaps wasn't what I should be doing, that I should be enough. I kept asking myself, why am I not enough? And on top of this, I had to spend some time just getting an everyday back. So a job and a place to live. And I guess this negotiation between the two sides of life, all the practical and then making work, is something that most people that make stuff faces every day. But this is where writing to people became quite useful. In the beginning, I was too scared to do it, but I was thinking back to this thing I learned at uni, where it's like, just go into the Lion's Cave, write to people. I said, okay, I'll write to people. And a little after little, I started to find people who I could speak to and who I could share language with. And I found few but very important people that I can do that with. But I've also found that it's important, in order to develop that, to be around people who doesn't understand me. Because every time I have to explain something, I'm learning something new about myself. And they're learning something new about themselves. And I think that when we do things together and show things to each other, and show each other what we mean, we learn something much more than just talking about it. So with the people I met, I also realized that the topic we spent most time talking about was how to nurture and grow the community of people who were working with performance here in Copenhagen, or in Denmark. And the problem isn't a lack of work. So many people are making work in this way. But I think maybe because there isn't a practice-based course here where you study performance, it's as if the community is harder to find. And I know you can study performance, there's performance studies, and there are the Scenekunstskole, and there are different places, but it's all as if it's on either side of the spectrum, and sometimes it's as if there needs to be something right in the middle between the theater and the visual arts and the academic, something right in between. And another thing that I noticed was that I found it hard to find places to go and see international performance work. I was so used to seeing work from the whole world, from Japan and from Germany and from Australia, and I found it hard to find out where to find that here. So something we are spending a lot of time talking about is where can we nurture that community, because all the people are there, but where should we meet? So I have ideas with people about starting a podcast where we interview performance makers. We talk about making small festivals, even though, of course, that already exists, but how can we have more of them? We talk about how to get more international work to Denmark so that we can have a bigger and larger conversation about how to make work and how people think other places and in other cultures. So I'm thinking a lot about how to develop the language and the shared language that there is around performance. And it's exciting, but it's also tough. And I feel like I'm starting this phase now where there is energy to both make my own work, but also spend time sort of nurturing a platform here that everyone can use. And I can't do that by myself, of course. It's something that a lot of people are part of. I'm going to stop here. I am also just wanting to mention that at the moment, if you're interested, at Den Frie Udstillingsbygning in Copenhagen, here, Østerport, I'm part of this collective called FUG, which is one of the first collaborators I found when I came to Denmark, Forening for Uafhængige Kunstnere København. And we've made this performative training center where people can come and play games that challenges the way we think about behavior and ethics. And that's sort of where I am now in my life, and we'll see where it goes. And that was it. Thank you for listening.